Hello again, this is SickleYield, and I'm here to talk to you about virtual world dynamics. A quick note before I get started, I've heard some complaints about how quiet these videos are on YouTube, and I have watched a lot of videos about working with the Yeti mic that I'm using, and most of the advice in them boils down to have a soundproof room, have the mic far from your computer, have a dedicated mic stand. At this time, I cannot do any of those things, so at the present time my choice is between having a clear recording or having a loud recording. I have chosen clear, so you're probably going to have to keep turning your volume up to listen to these videos. I regret that, but I don't know how to fix it right now. So, moving forward, I'm going to first tell you how to install Virtual World Dynamics, which is for sale at Renderosity. You will need to purchase both the base product, VWD Cloth and Hair, and the Daz Studio bridge, which is by a different vendor, so make sure that you have both of those before we start. Alright, now I have 3 folders open here. One is the folder to which I have copied the 2 zip files from Renderosity. This one for the product itself, for VWD Cloth and Hair, and this one, Studio Bridge 2, for the bridge to Daz Studio. I've unzipped each of those to a folder of the same name. I have this folder, which is the program files location of Daz Studio. On my computer, that's program files Daz 3D Daz Studio 4. And you can tell you're in the right folder if you have the dazstudio.exe icon in front of you. Or if you don't have extensions visible by default, it'll just say Daz Studio with this icon. And that is the correct folder for your program files directory. But you also need to open up the content directory. I have several content directories. This current one is the one I use for Renderosity. I have a tutorial on DeviantArt that discusses installing third-party content to various folders, and I highly recommend that. It's a good way to keep your content separate by vendor so that you can have your freebies in one folder, your Daz 3D products in one folder, your Renderosity things in another folder, etc. Now that I have both directories located, I'm ready to install the program and the bridge. First, I'm going to go into the folder to which I've unzipped VWD Cloth and Hair, and inside that there should be a folder called Runtime, and I'm going to copy that. And then I'm going to go to my directory for installing content. On your computer, if you installed to the default location, it is probably called My Daz 3D Library, and it's probably located in your documents. The important thing is that you see this runtime folder in front of you. So then I'm going to right-click in this folder at large and click Paste. And it will ask to merge the new runtime with the old runtime, and you want to say yes. I'm getting an override prompt because I actually already have the program installed. Now that's in the right place. We're going to go to VWD All again, back where I've got both of these unzipped, and I'm going to go into the Studio Bridge folder, and there's another subfolder called VWD Dist. Inside that is a folder called Scripts, and a folder called Win64, and a folder called Win32. You will use Win64 if, like me, you have a 64-bit version of Windows, and 32 if you have a 32-bit version. I don't know if this program actually supports Macintosh or not, so I cannot help you there. Now the scripts folder is the same for either version of Windows, so I'm going to right-click on that and copy it, and this one goes into the program files directory, not the content library. So you can actually see there's a script folder here, and that's what we're going to merge with. So I'm going to paste into this folder at large. It will ask to merge with scripts, and I'm going to say yes again. Okay. Then I'm going to go into the Win64 folder. You can see there is a folder called Plugins in this directory that holds the Daz Studio exe. So I'm going to paste into here, and once again choose yes to merge. There we are. I've already got that installed. Now you should be able to access the program from within Daz Studio. So I'm going to go over to Daz Studio here. I have this blue Genesis 3 female in a pose. She's blue so that we don't show inappropriate nudity on YouTube. And then I'm going to go to that same Renderosity directory under Daz Studio formats and scripts, and under that is VWD Bridge. Now the first time that you click on Start VWD, it will ask you to navigate to the location of one of the folders, one of the files, and that is actually located in Runtime, Python, PoserScripts, VWD, and you want startvwd.py. You should only have to navigate to that within Daz Studio on the first startup and never again after that. And then you can click on this and right-click and choose Create Custom Action, and it will add a shortcut to that under your scripts dialog up here. I do that a lot, so I've got a list of those scripts up here. And now, to select the garment that we're going to sim, I'm going to start with a shorter dress in hopes that it will go faster, so I'm going to use the go-go dress for Genesis 3 female. There we are. It's a one-piece geometry. Hopefully it has a reasonable number of polygons. That looks pretty dense, but we'll try it. And then I'm going to go to Scripts and VWD Python and wait for that to start. This appears on the right side of my screen, and under where it says Scene Import, I'm going to click Host List. Now it shows everything in my scene, which in this case is just Genesis 3 female and the dress. You want to include everything that you want the dress to collide with, but nothing else. So I'm just going to click on Genesis 3 female here and click Collision and apply parameters and generate. Then I'm going to click on go-go dress and import as cloth and apply parameters and generate with basically the default settings here. There's a good tutorial set by Biscuits on Renderosity that I highly recommend that explains more of these settings and what they mean individually. It is for poser, but as far as the buttons on VWD cloth and hair, it is very good. Now I've just clicked on Scene Viewer to expand VWD here so I can see Genesis 3 in the dress, and if I go down to vertices groups, it shows me all the vertices of the dress, and I'm actually going to freeze some of these vertices or nail them, as the program says, to ensure that it doesn't slide off the figure in a peculiar way. So I'm going to click and drag to select the vertices of the neck there to ensure that the turtleneck stays in place. And I'm going to click on Nail to Collision under Vertices Groups. Now I'm going to use a static sim because it is much faster. So I'm going to click on Simulation Parameters. You can see there are some settings here. At the moment I'm not going to change those. If we get a very blocky sim, subsamples and iterations are the ones that we may want to change. You may notice that I've checked spring reduction up here, and I'm going to leave that checked because it uses less memory. But for the moment, I'm going to click on Start Static Simulation. This program uses RAM to do sims, apparently. It doesn't appear to be using the CPU. The biggest problem that I generally have with it is that it can run out of memory. Alright, there we are. I'm going to stop static simulation, and that's that button, and then I'm going to click on the button that says Send Pose to Host. Then I will click on Scene Viewer to minimize again, and you can see that the dress is actually simmed. It has generated this other geometry called Go-Go Dress VWD, and there's a thing here called Morphs that actually shows the morph that it generated. I can turn that off, and it goes back to the way it looked before it was simmed, and I can dial it back in again. And that's really all there is to that. Now, this program in its current version cannot be reset, so in order to do the sim again, you actually have to close VWD cloth and hair, delete the go-go dress that's been simmed here, and restart again with the original, which is still here in the scene, but now it's hidden. Now I'm going to demonstrate hair. The program can do hair both as hair and as cloth. I'm going to do it as cloth because I've gotten a lot more out of memory errors with setting it as hair. So I'm going to go to the Smart Content again and look at the hairs that we have. There are a lot of great long hairs for Genesis 3. A lot of them will cause out-of-memory errors, in fact almost all of them, but I don't think I've tried the wildling hair, so let's try that and see what happens. I'll wait for that to run. I don't recommend trying to run this to collide with clothing. I recommend doing a custom morph to fix clipping, as in a previous tutorial of mine that's here on YouTube. But that is up to you if you'd like to try it. If you have a system with, I don't know, 500 gigabytes of RAM. I have 64, and it is not enough to do some long dresses and many Genesis 3 hairs. So, I'm going to start VWD again, and I'm going to choose Genesis 3 female as collision again. But this time I'm going to choose the wildling hair and set that as cloth. Apply parameters and generate. Now this is something that this program can do that no other Dynamics sim currently available to me can do. It can actually create a hair simulation wherein it extrapolates from the geometry of the hair and the proximity of vertices to each other, so that it will not fall apart wherever there's gaps in the geometry. Even Marvelous Designer currently cannot do that. They've been claiming that they will add that as a feature, but they have not yet. Nope, I got Mémoire Insuffisante, which I'm sure I just pronounced incorrectly, but that means that it ran out of memory. So I'm going to have to close VWD Cloth and Hair, delete the wildling hair from the scene, and choose a different hair. So I'm going to not select Genesis 3 female, and I'm going to go to Smart Content and look at all of the hairs that have ever been, and I'm going to actually choose one that was originally created for Genesis. In fact, I'm going to search perfect up here, because the perfect hairs for Genesis 1 are really great. I must mean pure hair. Let's try again. There we go, pure hair. These pure hairs for Genesis 1 are really great for sim, especially if you update their shaders. So before I try to sim that, I'm going to drag it onto head and hit Control E, and then I'm going to scale and position it on different axes so that it fits better on the character. And I'll go ahead and add a material. And you can also use Slosh's UHT shaders, and I highly recommend them for updating Genesis hairs to Genesis 3. I use these old pure hairs a lot when I want to do hair sim, and they work really well with the shaders updated. But for the moment, I'm going to right click and choose unparent, because if it's parented to Genesis 3 female, sometimes VWD cannot see it. Sometimes it will. And I'm going to start VWD again, and once again I'm going to go to host list and collision for Genesis 3 female, and then I'm going to choose PH Catwalk as soon as that becomes a possibility. Set that as cloth, and this one should not give a memory error because it is way lower poly than a Genesis 3 hair. Alright, I'm back again after the program crashed and I had to restart it and restart Daz Studio. Sometimes there's memory leakage from Daz Studio and then VWD will just refuse to do anything. And when that happens, you have to close VWD, restart the program, and restart your sim. So, let's try this again with Perfect Hair Catwalk, import as cloth. Let's see what it says. Or rather, let's see if it does it this time. I'm also running the video editing program that I use for this at the same time, which may be sucking up more RAM, I'm not sure. There we go, it looks like it actually did it that time. So let's click on Scene Viewer. There we go. There's the hair, there's Genesis 3 female. You can see it's clipping with her a little bit. So there's another feature of the program that I'm going to use here. Down here under Vertices Tools, I'm first going to attach this to the top of her head so that it doesn't escape, because hair will slide right off the head otherwise. So that's actually under Vertices Groups. I'm going to select some hair up here and choose Nail to Collision. There we go. Then I'm going to go to Simulation Parameters. And down here you can see Dynamic Deformation where it says on the fly or nailed. I'm going to leave it at nailed right now and click Start Static Simulation. But if I hold down the Alt key and drag the hair, I can actually pull it around a little bit. In this case, I don't really need to do that, it looks like, because it actually looks like it fixed the clipping just fine on its own. And I'll let that static sim run until I think it looks right. You can see it sort of bouncing back and forth as the sim runs. Maybe I can drag this out of the way here. Oh, it's actually Shift that I need to hold and not Alt. My bad. So I'm actually going to hold Shift and drag this section of hair behind the shoulder and see if I can get that to work without crashing the program. At that point, it will refuse to move until I hold down Shift again, so you want to use this feature sparingly. And there's also a chance that it will do something like that where it just completely freaks out in place. So I'm going to hold that with left click and drag it back here. And then I have to keep holding down Shift for that to run. I assume that's an error that might be fixed in a later version of the program. I don't know, but it can be a bit annoying, especially with a larger, heavier sim, so you definitely want to use that sparingly. Looks like that's still freaking out a little bit back here. But I did get it to stay behind the shoulder. So at this point I'm going to stop holding down Shift, and I'm going to click Stop Static Simulation, and send pose to host. Then I will click Scene Viewer, and you can see that the hair is now behind the character's shoulder, just as we simmed it. And once again, it's created a duplicate of the geometry here that actually has a morph that shows the progress of the sim. So you can actually dial that back to 0 and dial the sim back on. Alright, next I'm going to do a dynamic sim. This is a little bit tougher, it's a little bit harder to do, but you can use it to simulate things that are not by default rigged, so it definitely has that benefit. In this case, I've started with Genesis 3 Female in 0 pose, and I'm going to import a dynamic that I created. Here's this very short ragged dress. It's certainly not Daz Store ready, but it will do for our sim. You can see that it's one piece here, and this is not rigged. It is not a conformer, so it will not move with the character. Down here I have a timeline. Because I use the City Limits workspace layout, this is usually hidden here. You can show it or hide it if you're using City Limits. And I have set it to go from 0 to 80. Down here on the right hand corner you can see 0 and FPS 80, because I want it to have plenty of time to simulate. If you just go to 30, it won't always be enough for a full complex pose like I want to use. So at 0, you can see this yellow arrow that indicates the progress of the timeline. I'm going to hit this little key with a plus sign on it down here that adds a keyframe, sort of a bookmark for the program. Then I'm going to drag that arrow all the way to 60. At 60, I'm going to pose Genesis 3 Female, and then add another keyframe, hitting that little key button with the plus sign on it. And now, when I drag this yellow arrow back along the timeline with my mouse, you can see Genesis 3 Female getting into that pose. This is animation in its very simplest form in Daz Studio. Now I'm going to drag that back to 0, and I'm going to start VWD. Okay, in Virtual World Dynamics, I'm going to click Host List again and select Genesis 3 Female and import as collision. There we go. Then I'm going to select the short ragged dress, and I'm going to import as cloth, and apply parameters and generate. This is a low poly object, so it should be pretty fast. Here we go. Now, instead of just hitting start static, I'm going to do something else. First, I'm going to go to Vertices Groups, and click and drag to select that shoulder area, and hold Control and click and drag to select the hip area, or rather around the waist. And I'm going to nail those to collision so that this does not fall off. Then I'm going to go up here to Simulation Parameters and start Dynamic Simulation. And it will pick up Genesis 3 Female's pose from the scene. As you can see, the sim is actually a bit fast for the clothing, so it's kind of flying off the figure. If you end up not liking your animation and want to start over, you can go to frame 0 by dragging the yellow arrow, go to the Parameters tab, make sure your figure is selected, and then click on the little button at the top of the tab and choose Clear Animation, Clear Figure. Now, when I drag along the timeline, there is no animation at all. I can do that for the camera as well, actually. Clear Animation, Clear Selected Items. So it should not animate the camera anymore. Although now I need to reset the camera to its default position. There we go. So, I'm actually going to leave this at FPS 30, but I'm going to go over here to the left to total and set the total to 200. And then I have 200 frames, but 30 frames per second, so it should be slower if I set the animation to go over a longer number of frames. So actually I'm going to set the total to 400, and I'm going to drag it over to 200, and at 200 I'm going to pose Genesis 3 female. And I've tried this a few times now with different amounts of success, so I think I'm actually going to try it with a more forgiving pose. This one right here. And I'm going to add a keyframe by hitting the little key with a plus sign in it. And that should work for us. I'm going to go back and forth a couple times here. I need to go back to 0 and then 0 the figure pose and add a keyframe there. That was my mistake. So keyframe at 0, keyframe at 200. There we go. Now I've got more frames down here for the dress to finish simming. I'm going to drag it back to 0, and I'm going to start VWD. Host list, Genesis 3 female as collision, and then I'll set the dress up as cloth again by clicking on the dress, clicking on cloth, and clicking apply parameters and generate. There we go. Then I will once again pin the shoulders by selecting those with dragging and holding down control and dragging around the waist area, and then clicking on vertices groups, nail to collision. Then I will go to simulation parameters and start dynamic simulation. It should go nice and slowly. You can see the character is not moving very quickly. This ensures that I've given it enough frames so that the cloth will not fly off into space. You won't always need to go this extreme number of frames. In fact, most of the time you probably won't. But in this case, I have a small clothing item and a very big difference in the figure's pose from start to finish. If I hit the Scene Viewer button so that VWD is back to its smaller size, you can actually see the frames progress in Daz Studio as they progress in the program. Alright, now it's finished, and it will keep playing that in a cycle in VWD until you click the button that says Send Animation to Host, which is what I'm going to do right now. But first of all, notice that because I gave it a lot more frames, it actually has time for the dress to settle properly. It does float up a little bit in the faster first few frames of the animation, but because we increased the number of frames, it's not too bad, and there's time for it to settle back down again without flying off of the character's arm. So I'm going to go ahead and click Send Animation to Host. You can see it importing dynamic cloth animation, and the wonderful thing about this is that now it has actually created a different morph for every single frame. It has created 200 and actually I think 398 morphs, one for every frame. So when I drag this back across the timeline, you can see every frame of that animation just as it was calculated. But your nice endpoint here has your simmed dress. It would take a little longer to calculate, and we might risk a little more memory loss if I added another object for it to collide with, but that is certainly possible to do when you want it to collide with a seat. I have gotten it to do that before, but it took many, many attempts. Alright, this concludes my tutorial with this powerful, fascinating, and incredibly finicky program. Thank you for watching, and happy rendering!